Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. I'm Safwan Masri. I'm Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University, and it really is my great pleasure to welcome you all here for today's important discussion. Over the past year, we've defined our global crises largely around the COVID-19 pandemic, and understandably so. Most international crisis related discourse has been concerned with the impact of the pandemic. Yet, in the decade prior to the appearance of COVID 19, another global crisis was already unfolding. In a few minutes' time, just as I finish my introduction to today's webinar, over 100 people will have been compelled to leave their homes. Nearly half of those will become stateless, displaced not only within their countries, but forced to migrate across borders, their routes guided by the hope of finding food, shelter, jobs, and if they are very fortunate, a welcoming environment. The causes for displacement are numerous and complicated. Natural and ecological disasters, poverty, social unrest, socioeconomic expulsion, and violent conflict. Unspeakable horrors that need immediate attention and action. Now, at Columbia University and Columbia Global Centers, we affirm that as an institution with global reach, we are determined to help meet the needs of our global society. We are committed to research into the myriad issues involved in forced migration and to engaging meaningfully in providing solutions. Thus, today's important webinar. But first, a word or two about Columbia Global Centers and the Columbia Committee on Forced Migration. The Columbia Global Centers are in 9 locations around the world, plus another 9 pop-ups serving our international students as study and community spaces during the pandemic. These centers serve as Columbia's physical and intellectual global infrastructure, facilitating knowledge exchange, research collaborations, and education programs to advance our understanding of and engagement with the world. Columbia Global Centers work within countries that host large numbers of refugees, such as the Global Center in Amman, which is where I am today, Istanbul, Nairobi, and Tunis. Now, today's webinar is under the auspices of the Committee on Forced Migration, which is an initiative of the Columbia Global Centers that is coordinated by Dr. Kian Tajbakhsh, from whom you will hear in a minute. It was established in 2018, and it brings together more than 50 faculty members from across Columbia's schools and affiliates who work on forced migration, as well as those who desire to create multidisciplinary academic and practical solutions to the forced migration crisis. The committee aims to provide an institution-wide platform to engage, support, and share information across Columbia's community of faculty, students, and staff, act as a convener to bring the world's thought leaders in global migration together, and serve as a channel for communicating Columbia's work in this space to the global community and advance public discourse. This Committee on Forced Migration initiative is one of a number of forced migration related activities the Global Center supports. These include a university wide scholarship for displaced students, the first of its kind in the world, for up to 30 students a year who will have their tuition and living expenses covered while they attend any of the 18 schools at Columbia. The Amman Mellon Foundation Global Centers Fellowship Program for Emerging Displaced Scholars is another important program that's part of our initiatives. We are also a founding member of the New University in Exile Consortium, and we have now a year-long series of webinars that looks at the impact of the pandemic crisis on forced migration, both present and long-term effects. The series will provide opportunities to explore issues from within different disciplines and contexts. It will examine the history of anti-immigrant racism, issues of density and urban living in a post-COVID world, and the role of journalism in humanitarian crises. We will explore a globalized economy as a contributing factor to forced migration, and we will survey literature of the migrant experience. Now, today's discussion, the dangers of density, the future of cities, and migration in a post-COVID world, is part of this series. The topic is of particular interest to me, not only because of its importance, but because I'm a great fan of my colleague and friend Saskia Sassen, the esteemed Robert S. Lynd Professor of Sociology at Columbia University, who is one of our featured speakers, along with Alain Bertaud. We're very, very delighted to have both of them, and Kian will introduce them more fully in a minute. Saskia's books, incidentally, most recently, Expulsions, and then later Cities at War, Global Insecurity and Urban Resistance, are caringly incisive and instructive for anyone who wants to learn about displacement and its causes. The efforts of the Committee on Forced Migration effort, plus what we may be able to inspire in all of you today, will help us create a roadmap to a future that takes seriously the need to build a more equitable and sustainable society. Often, perhaps without even realizing it, our vision is nostalgic, an effort to reclaim the world that we once knew. This webinar and those that follow in this series will help us plan realistically so that we can create habitats that will be viable in the world to come. And now I would like to introduce my colleague and today's moderator, Dr. Kian Tajbakhsh. Dr. Tajbakhsh works on university-wide initiatives that are focused on global migration. Kian is also a fellow with Columbia's Committee on Global Thought, where since 2016, he has taught the core course, Globalization and the Problems of World Order. Before that, Kian was professor of urban planning at Columbia. His research interests include comparative study of global urbanization with a focus on local democracy. Thank you, Kian, for the work that you do. I will now turn the webinar over to you and for you to introduce today's esteemed panelists. Kian? Kian, you need to unmute, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Safwan, for those introductory remarks and kind words. Now it is a special privilege, personal privilege for me to moderate a panel with two of the world's leading urbanists, Professor Saskia Sassen and Professor Alain Bertaud, both of whom I've had the honor of learning from and working with for many years. As Safwan mentioned, Saskia is the Robert Lynd Professor of Sociology and the former chair of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University. There are too many books to list now, but I will mention a few of the most important. Her many books have been translated into over 20 languages, and these include Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, which was published by Harvard University Press and translated into 12 languages. Her books, such as Cities in a World Economy, Sociology of Globalization, are textbooks in many universities, and The Global City, published in 1991 by Princeton, was one of the first works to introduce the idea of the global city. She is the recipient of many awards and has been selected as one of the top 100 women in the social sciences in 2018. I'm honored to say that Saskia was the chair of my PhD dissertation committee at Columbia almost 3 decades ago. It also gives me great personal pleasure to introduce Alain Bertaud, who is a fellow at the Marron Institute at New York University. His book, Order Without Design, How Markets Shape Cities, published by MIT Press in 2018, was praised by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer as a seminal contribution to the understanding of cities. Alain previously held the position of principal urban planner at the World Bank for a number of decades. After retiring from the bank in 1999, he worked as an independent consultant and resident planner in many cities around the world. These include Bangkok, San Salvador, Port-au-Prince, Sana'a in Yemen, New York, Paris, in Algeria, Chandigarh in India, and Shenzhen in China. Professor Edward Glaser of Harvard University has said that everything he knows about land use restrictions and urban planning in developing countries he has learned from Alain. I can second that opinion. I first came to know of Alain when in 2003, he traveled to Tehran as part of a World Bank team and prepared a report which I consider to be one of, if not the best analysis of the problems facing Tehran metropolis to have been produced. And I never hesitated to say this, much to the consternation of my Iranian urban specialist colleagues. His analysis of other cities around the world are also, in my view, without peer. I am delighted that both Saskia and Alain can join us today to share their insights into cities, the pandemic, and the impacts on migration. Before I turn it over to Alain, I would remind the audience to please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So with that, I turn over to our first speaker, Alain Bertaud. Alain?
Thank you so much for inviting me and for this very generous introduction, Kian. That was very nice of you. I would like to divide my talk into, in fact, two topics which are related but still quite different. One will be the pre-pandemic and post-pandemic cities, whether really there are, let's say, many changes which are going to happen between those two stages. And the second will be international migration between low and high productivity cities. I will try to here take the point of view of both the people who are forced or decide to migrate. I mean, there is always a push factor, of course, but sometimes it's a very strong push and sometimes it's a weaker one. But I would like also to take the point of view of the cities, some of the cities of the world, which could largely benefit from having migrations. And I would say even that migration will be indispensable if they want to maintain their welfare state. So that will be the two parts of my talk. Let us start with the pre-pandemic cities. You know, after all, cities have always, you know, existed. I mean, since at least agriculture, and they have endured plagues. And is this pandemic really different? Cities are basically labor market. People go to cities to work and to meet other people, you know, and firms go to cities because in cities they find the skill that they need, including also the unskilled that they need. But those markets historically work with face-to-face contact. There was no possibility to have a labor market or even labor without face-to-face contact. Before the pandemic, we had already a number of people were working at home and sometime in the same city as their firm, sometime in different cities. But that, if we look at the United States, just before the pandemic, the number of people working from home, that means abandoning the face-to-face contact, were only about 8% of the labor force. Not that much, you know, some cities are more, some other, but the average in the US was about 8%. During the pandemic, this of course changed. The technology to communicate also changed and improve, and people became more familiar with it. Will that really change? If really the face-to-face contact is not important in a labor market, then in a certain way, you could say that you don't need cities. Now, let us get back to Earth now. A lot of jobs cannot be done without face-to-face contact. I'm thinking of restaurants, bars, entertainment, but also a lot of creative jobs cannot be done, I think, with face-to-face contact. We are increasingly specialized, and this specialty require having very close contact with other people who have slightly different skills than ours, or even completely different skills. And this can be, of course, planned. You can say, for instance, as an urban planner, I can say, I want to consult a water supply specialist. I can find this person and discuss an agenda. My experience, my professional experience, is that my most fruitful contact were random, were not planned. it was people I met at a seminar or even sometime in an office or in the street or in a restaurant or were friend of friend. So I think that this face-to-face contact is going to continue. Don't forget that whatever, as an urbanist, I say this is likely to happen. It's only my opinion. At the end, it's going to be households who decide whether they want to work from home or they want to go once a week to the firm or they have to go every day because of the nature of their work. And that will be also the firms. The firms will decide if they think that their employees are as productive and creative if they work from home and never met each other except on Zoom, or if they have to come to their headquarters. What made me think that a lot of people will still work, have a link, let's say physical link with their headquarters, is in the last few years, the big firms of Silicon Valley built enormous and very costly headquarters. You look at Google, for instance, Facebook, Apple. They built enormous headquarters, and those headquarters were not just prestige, like the corporate headquarters, let's say, of General Motors or things like that, to receive important clients. Those headquarters were designed to attract the maximum number of workers in their headquarters, like excellent restaurant, for instance, cafeteria with different type of food, daycare centers for women who wanted to come with their children. You have no problem with that. So I cannot believe that the COVID, the pandemic will have erased all this constraint. So my guess is that we have to let's say watch very carefully what is happening, and in order to have an infrastructure which serve the new movement of people, whether they are linked to their headquarters or whether they work outside. Now, there is one question which was implied in the title of the seminar. It was whether density is an enemy. What we have seen really, and I'm going to share my screen here. What we have seen, that density really in the long run is not a danger for the pandemic. What is the danger is poverty. That means if you have an entire family, 3 generations living in 2 rooms, this is very, very dangerous for a pandemic. But if you are living in a high density neighborhood on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and the density here can reach 800 people per hectare, this is not dangerous. So here is, for instance, in the case of United States, the density of states which have very low density, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and then states which have a high density, New York, and then the District of Columbia, which is just one city. And you see that there is absolutely no correlation. Actually, the one with, as an urban planner, I would say ridiculous densities like North Dakota and South Dakota have in fact higher case per million population of COVID case than the one with. Now, we were tricked into thinking that density was a problem because, of course, usually cities with high densities are much more connected to the rest of the world, and if you are much more connected, you get hit first. So that was, I think, the question. I will therefore dismiss densities. Now, let us, as a problem, and again, what I see in the new cities after COVID is that probably older people, older professionals who have already a vast network of colleagues may want to get a bit loose from their headquarters and may even want to move to a smaller city or even the countryside. But I think that the younger people will want to stay in the center of cities, because that's, they need to establish connection, they need to change jobs and things like that. So that's that I think what we will see a shift, and this will be actually, I think, facilitated because in the CBD of the large city, there is a drop in the real estate prices. So I could see here a swap where the older people who are wealthier usually, who have bought their real estate long ago, will move to either suburbs or smaller cities, which are environmentally more comfortable, and they will be replaced by younger workers. If this, of course, will require that cities change completely their land use regulation, which are extremely rigid and do not allow this change of use. There will be also a change of use between probably office building and residential, like it has started actually in New York long ago. So that's why, but that again are just my estimate. I am not saying we should do that or this is what should be planned. We should observe what is happening. At the end, the one will decide will be households and there will be firms. Now, let us look at the migration issue. Excuse me. I will divide cities between two categories. The one which have are in high productivity, but are located in countries which have a very low fertility rate and therefore are in the long run are losing population or have an aging population. And I will contrast that with cities which are usually in the developing economy, which are not very productive. They have a deficiency in infrastructure, which, if you work and you are a genius and you are very creative, but you are in Bamako and the electricity run out, 5 hours a day, your productivity, doesn't matter what your skill is, your productivity is going to be low. And so if we compare those two cities, and they are spread a bit all over the world, I think that, instead of looking just at policy, let us look at what is, let's say, what is the interest of the migrant? For instance, again, if I take the example of Bamako, if I am a young, let's say, a young couple in Bamako who have gone through, did, quite efficient studies, is your interest, do you work in Bamako and continue working there in spite of the difficulties, or do you migrate to one of those efficient cities which are desperate for people in a way, although they don't recognize it very often, and you could have an immediate gratification. Now, here I am assuming that there is a pull which is higher than the push. For many people, they have no choice. For instance, if you are in El Salvador now, or in Central America, there is hardly any choice. If you are concerned about the health of your children and their education, migration is nearly required. So now let us look at the point of view of the cities. So I will again share my screen here. Sorry, that was here is it's a Japanese city, the growth of Japanese city, and horizontally I have the size of the city, so which varies from 0. In fact, the cities which are here are all above 1 million, up to 15 million. These are the prefecture, not necessarily the entire conurbation. And sorry, and so the horizontal line here at 0 is 0% growth. and so we see that we have 4 quadrants here. The one at the bottom left has practically all the cities which are below 5 million, and with the exception of 3 cities, all of them have a negative growth rate, demographic growth rate. If we take the other quadrant, the opposite quadrant, where Tokyo is, we have very, very few cities, usually larger than 5 million cities, and Tokyo being the largest. And they are the ones who attract migrants, in fact, from the smaller city. This is rather unique in the history of the cities. Usually, the growth of cities maintain an equilibrium between the smaller and the higher one. Now, and this is, by the way, a problem, which is the Japanese were the first to face this problem, but it's a problem which is faced by Western Europe. And it is a problem which now is being faced by South Korea. And within about 10 years, China will have this problem too. So those countries have a welfare state. That means that their equilibrium, the system, the social system, is based on a large number of workers compared to the number of people who are retired. And the system works relatively well if there is this proportion. This was in a way created by the generation after the war, where you had suddenly a great number of births. This is reversed, and the system are not sustainable. The US get away with it in a way because they were relatively lenient with migration, whether they were legal or illegal. Now, as we have seen in the last 4 years, suddenly there is a backlash against migration. But so we could see that although the US by European standard is not a welfare state, it still have a system of Medicare and Social Security, which is really based on having new migrants. You need to have more active people compared to the people who are retired. So let's say, what I see here now is that some countries, for instance, say Singapore or the Gulf country, have tried to solve the problem by not having permanent migration, but selecting people to work in certain fields, like nurses or workers in construction, and on fixed contract. That means those people will never become citizens. They come to work, when their contract is finished, back home. Japan now is considering a system like that. The European system is more, so far, is more like, if you migrate to work, you should become eventually citizen. Although they have never completely be explicit about that. So my proposal here is that we should have all the countries which look at their demographic, their age pyramid, will look and develop a migration policy which is based on precisely integrating migrants and to become citizen, because in the long run, they cannot escape that. And for that, you should not only open some of your frontier, but you should assist the integration of this with education, in particular for the children. The children of the migrants should be complete urban citizen with them. So it is not a freebie. You will have to invest in it, but you will have a definite, so that those cities like Copenhagen, which are marvelous, well-oiled machine in terms of the way they are managed, are not suddenly dwindling and disappearing because there is nobody there. Let us, they need citizens to fulfill this role. And by the time enough people migrate there, then it's possible that Bamako would have developed its infrastructure and be productive and possibly attract people from other parts of the world. So this is basically my point of view at the moment. And again, I'm not saying this is a plan, you should do it. I'm saying this is a problem you have. If you want to solve it, this is the way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alain.
44 seconds.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alain. I think you've raised a lot of interesting issues, and I'm sure there will be questions. Let me remind the audience, please, to enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Okay, I think it's time now to move to Saskia. I turn it over to you, Saskia. Please unmute your.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, very good. Well, it was an enormous pleasure for me to hear Alain Bertaud. Really, I have followed your work, and I was just delighted. I'm very glad you talked and talked and talked. I like that. Now, so I want to address a few sort of slightly different elements here, and one framing notion I want to bring in is something that one could think of as when the global breaks down into endless localities. And it seems to me that right now, thanks to the virus, we're actually experiencing that transformation. Even in a city like New York, in a city like Los Angeles, where you have vast numbers of people, something is different, and something has entered, if you want, our imaginaries, and it's not so easy to totally get rid of that. So one way of putting it is to say that the urban condition is going through some serious and unexpected transformations. We may not see that in the buildings, in the materiality of it all, but we see it more in the social condition. And in that sense, I would argue that this is a peculiar period, a kind of period we did not see coming, a period that has taken us by surprise and that keeps unsettling us because it is mobile. Things keep changing. We know now that there are all kinds of new viruses, which are, some of them at least, are more powerful, etc. So this virus, in its invisibility, no sound, no smell, has actually forced changes. These changes are not necessarily visible. They're not material changes, but they are changes. So one element here is that there are all sorts of minor and major elements in the current situation that tell us that the local has gained a new kind of importance, a new set of meanings. It's not the city, it's the locality that seems to count quite more in this particular period. Now, one key actor in this ascendance of the local is, of course, COVID-19. This silent, invisible presence has shown us its capacity to unsettle life as it used to be. We seem to have entered a new era, one that has installed itself in our daily lives in ways we did not think could happen in our modernity. More time spent enclosed in our homes, a radical stop to global travel. I really notice that part. I travel a lot, and isolating from friends and from urban life. So a question these unexpected developments raise is whether such transformations could change spatial development. Is that capacity actually also in play? For instance, we might wind up with a partial hollowing out of city centers and the growth of more localized work options in neighborhoods. So two juxtapositions that are against what has been the mode. Thus, leisure and shopping patterns that used to concentrate in major cities might branch out to neighborhoods. We might neighborhoods. We might see the return, if you want, of local shops of all sorts in those neighborhoods, and little shops, shops owned by local actors. I really like that idea also. Now, so with such changes would also come challenges, notably the raising of tax revenue and of existing spending patterns by governments. It would actually mean a redistribution of the money that governments have given to various parts of the city. More would go, I would argue, if they did it properly, more would go to the lower income neighborhoods. So that would be a second sort of ironic benefit, if you want, from what we're living through. Now, under current conditions, it is especially the local that we need. And we often need it urgently. The local has become the site of the drama and the site of help and hope. The drama is all over us, but what matters for daily life is our condition as community, less as individuals and more as neighborhood. Whom can I call in a moment of despair when things get worse? My neighbor. A neighbor that I might have coexisted with for 30 years, but never even paid attention to. There are indeed all sorts of minor and major elements in the current situation that tell us that the local has gained a new kind of importance and a new set of meanings. I sort of repeat a bit because I do think that also the meanings are in play here. Could it be that COVID-19, this most global of pandemics, far more global than all past pandemics we have known, might in fact become a major changer of spatial development, hollowing out city centers and localizing far more work in neighborhoods? This could in turn bring a whole new world of leisure and shopping patterns to neighborhoods. I think the neighborhoods are going to be the surprise in this current condition, that they will matter more than they have mattered in quite a while. And if the neighborhoods, both prosperous and poor, become the sites for work and leisure and shopping, we might succeed in reducing long commutes and the exhaustion that comes with that, with the workers that have to travel long distances. Could COVID-19, with all its tragic outcomes, also become a major factor in transforming the organizing of our cities, not allowing massive concentrations of most jobs in city centers and the long, tiring trips to work that come with that? It would partly hollow out what are now major city centers, but perhaps that is not so bad. Our major city centers are far too big, requiring far too long travel for most middle class and working class employees. And current spending patterns by governments are increasingly overlooking far too many modest neighborhoods. We're seeing the emergence of an expanding disregard of the hardships of a majority of workers who have longer trips to work and fewer options in their own neighborhoods. So if the pandemic can actually reassign, remobilize, et cetera, that would actually be a very interesting, I would be very grateful, partly, to the pandemic then. We would still have great city centers, but of more reasonable and attractive size. One somewhat ironic outcome is then that COVID has brought new value to the local. Or, I mean, this is not a, this is a partial condition, but I do think that it is, in that partiality, it has brought new value to the local. Already quite a time before the coronavirus hit, Paris actually was beginning to emerge as a paragon for a new kind of distributed economy in major cities. It labels itself the 15-minute city. I think we're all aware of this now. That is a city where a 15-minute walk should, guaranteed, you can guarantee it, can give you access to the basic needs of everyday life. Today, a rapidly growing number of neighborhoods in Paris pride themselves with providing access to basic daily needs in, yes, a radium of 15-minute walks. The aim is that we can walk to more and more of the entities we need access to in our daily lives. In many ways, Tokyo impressed me already several decades ago. I spent quite a bit of time in Tokyo with its widely distributed commercial sites. Not one huge center as we see in New York or London, but multiple smaller centers that have it all. These are centers that they are all extraordinarily well provided. More and more cities are beginning to recognize the importance of multiple smaller centers. Such more localized work, leisure, and shopping sites could also make a difference in how local and national governments raise taxes and could reduce costs associated with driving cars and the pollution that comes with that, as well as protect more generally air quality. The challenges such a new set of conditions can bring to the raising of tax revenues and existing spending patterns by governments are a whole other domain, that requires really its own expertise, but we can sort of detect the elements of that, really a foundational redistribution of these types of monies really that the central governments have to more and more places that could really use it if they have a lot of shops, if they have a lot of activity. Hopefully, the aim would be to achieve a widely distributed combination of elements and to take on with gusto, with pleasure, the challenges such a society would bring to A, the raising of tax revenue, that's always a problem, and B, existing spending patterns by governments. And the outcome would be a proliferation of medium-sized neighborhoods thriving with activity and ensuring that most of what we need can be reached in that, this is a bit exaggerated clearly, 15-minute walk to the local shops. The new type of city that Paris is aiming at. And I must say, it gives me an enormous pleasure that Paris has entered the picture of the whole sort of urban condition in places across the world with this notion of as we all know, the 15-minute city, and that it's not always, New York and London, but Paris. I think that really has gone extremely well. Now, I'm just wondering whether I should keep it at this, very short, since we're running out of time and there might be some questions. I think we have like 15 minutes left. So why don't I just stop and what do you think? Yes?
Okay, Saskia. Okay, thank you very much, Saskia. That was a very clear and a bold, I think, thesis. I'm going to take a few minutes to pose a few questions to you and Alain as we are gathering the other questions that have been posted. I think one place to start would be to ask Alain to perhaps respond from his point of view, how he assesses the potential of the pandemic to move us towards what Saskia has referred to as the 15-minute city. In your own work, Alain, you have emphasized the fact that even polycentric cities still are dependent on some kind of centricity, some kind of agglomeration. And I wonder what your assessment is of the thesis that Saskia has put forward and your view of the mayor of Paris's idea of a 15-minute city. Is a 15-minute city a city of neighborhoods? Is that the same as a polycentric city? And if not, how do they differ? Alain, we can start the conversation, I think, with that, and then we can go back. We can have a little bit of a conversation. Thank you.
Yes, this is an interesting proposal, but let us look at Paris. First, the mayor of Paris is the mayor of a city of 2.5 million, in the middle of a metropolis of now 11 million. So she's talking about historical Paris.
Yeah, I know.
Historical Paris has do not have a zoning. You know, it has very strict regulation about the size of windows or you know, the height of building and a lot of conservation, but it doesn't have a zoning. That means that you can open a shop anywhere. There's not a zoning like in New York, which says CB2, and this, you can only have this type of thing here. So in a way, at the same time, Paris have a historically high density. By the way, Paris has lost nearly 1 million people. Paris within you know, the top population was in fact in 1912. You know, the glory of Paris with the, you know, the end of the Expressionists. That was Paris. So so what Saskia is mentioning about a loss of importance of the CBD is something which has happened practically everywhere. Manhattan also had more population, also strangely enough around 1912 than it has now. So this is now let us get back to the 15-minute thing. So in Paris, if you have a density of 250 people per hectare, and you have Parisian who like to have a fresh croissant every morning, you have indeed the possibility for a bakery to locate themselves within 15 minutes of their customers. But this is possible because they can sell enough croissant within the 15 minutes thing.
Exactly, yes, I know.
So if I want to open a bakery with croissant in my little town of Glen Rock, New Jersey, the density here is not enough. I will not survive, even if everybody like croissant as much as I do. The bakery will not survive. Plus, of course, I will have the enormous problem of zoning. You know, I will have to locate only in a very small area, so probably land will be expensive there. I will be competing with some, you know, with probably McDonald's or something, which have much more debit. So you see, these things are nice. I mean, now here we are. Sorry, I'm taking a little time, but I think it's an important thing. What bothers me a bit with Paris is not the 15 minutes to get your croissant or whatever.
Are you French?
I am French, yeah. I am.
Right.
Although I have a New Jersey accent, but I am French. So, so you know, they are talking about 15 minutes for a job. Now, if you look at Paris right now, including people who live in the center of Paris, you see that a relatively large number of them are commuting to the suburbs from Paris, although they have plenty of jobs in Paris. When you select a job, if you move to Paris, you select the best job possible. You want to change job when you find one which either pay more or is more interesting. And the idea of coming to a large city is precisely to have this enormous choice. So I have data to prove that in many, many cities, that people who are close to many jobs select to commute longer distance because the job is more attractive. So sorry, I've taken too much time, but it's a subject.
I wanted to bring in a few other elements now that you tell me, Kian, that we have a bit more time. And that is, we just completed a big project whose name is Cities at War. And it has to do with particular cities in the world today that are really in the middle of wars of all kinds. These are not the big wars of World War I and World War II. They're little wars, but there they are. And we produced a book on that. And it was really extraordinarily interesting to get to the details, you know, how a city can be transformed into a space for war. And the thing that hit us the most, we spent several years, it was a very big project, very well funded, you know, so we got a lot of data. But one of the issues that stood out was something that was called the yogurt run. I don't know if that phrase means something, but the notion of yogurt, yogurt and run means that it was cutting across war zones from one community, and that produced a particular kind of yogurt, but there were other examples that had to do with other elements. But the point here was that those cities were at war, mostly in the east of Europe, and yet the communication between cities was there in the form of very particular, often very modest instruments. And for instance, one that we sort of picked up on and that illuminated for us a whole set of options was yogurt. The one city that made great yogurt that had been selling, to all kinds of other cities in that region, but that because of war, of course, had to stop. But it didn't take very long, even if they were at war, for the yogurt run to come back into the picture. And so I want to send you that book of ours, because it was just so amazing how that kind of practical daily life element kept the cities, those were mostly they're not very big cities in Eastern Europe, kept them connected. And that also struck me, that besides the war that cities can be part of course, there are so many other elements that are in play, unlike, say, the army. The army has one project, so to say, whereas a city is extraordinarily complex, full of different options, etc. Anyhow, I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Saskia. I have just one more question to both of you, and that is just to really bring out, I think, maybe one of the main themes that the Saskia's thesis and Alain's qualification really brings up for us, and that is, many times before we heard the argument that technology, which allows remote working, will loosen the power of geography and the power of location. And that was part of the discussion over the last 2 or 3 decades. And yet, even during that time, we saw agglomeration increasing, and that the correlation between large agglomerations, especially in the developing world, was that large agglomerations was a source of economic productivity and a source of economic growth for countries. Now, my question is, the COVID, many people have said that it's been a kind of accelerator for a set of technological changes that may have otherwise taken 50 years. So I wonder whether you think there is something different about the technology of remote working, which will make geography even less deterministic, or you think cities still retain the countries and economies still need urban agglomerations for improving productivity. I just wonder whether you think there's something different about the technology. Even 2 or 3 days a week of remote work, do you think that will significantly change our understanding of urban agglomeration, the importance of concentration? I think Saskia suggested it might, and I think I'm trying to hear that Alain is suggesting it might not. And I just want to get your thoughts on that, on this question.
Well, if I can
yes, please go ahead, Saskia.
So it seems to me that it depends, of course, on the size of cities. The cities that I was describing in Eastern Europe that were at war, those are mostly rather smallish cities, but they are cities. They function as cities. If you take cities like New York, London, the really big cities, not even mention the Chinese big cities, I think then the story changes, because those are cities that have multiple cities inside them. It's not one city. It's very difficult. And when you bring in questions of origins, like in China right now, this is quite an issue. that where are the people from? You know, what part? China is so huge. It has so many different cultures, so many different deep histories, that to say, I come from China, if you're saying that in China, that's simply not enough. You have to say, what part of China, you know, etc. So that already gives you an indication of a possibility of a model that we might also see in a city like New York, by the way, that combines both a vast amount of space, far too big a zone, you know, that we would call the urban, and at the same time can contain within it, and this I find interesting, an extraordinary mix of origins of people. So that we go back to a model like it's almost an imperial model, where you have people from many different, they are not citizens, one type of citizen. No, they are citizens, yes, for the law, etc. But they also represent other histories. They come from many different places. And I think that it's something that we hadn't thought about could happen in a city like New York, in a city like London. But it is happening there. You know, it is happening in a very marked way. And that, I think, is a kind of novel recognition. This is something that we hadn't seen coming, but because we were focused, for instance, in the case of New York, on the fact that people were leaving the city because there's not enough housing, housing is too expensive or whatever, and living in the suburbs, you know, and traveling an hour or an hour and a half, etc. But what if the city itself becomes the container of multiple differences, multiple different cultures? Cities are set up for that. And so the thing about China, it really struck me very much, and how the different identities of different origin stories for Chinese, how they have kept attached to that, and how that matters, that marks these people. We don't have that in the West. In the West, we are sort of, you know, it's a more generic condition. But what I'm also saying is that the urban condition is changing, number one. Number two, it is changing also into many different formats that carry more weight than, you say, the usual differences that we might see in a city. You know, something is changing. And in many ways, it doesn't surprise me. Why should the urban condition that emerges, you know, 200 years ago, in a way, under this current mode, why should it last forever? So the formats change, die, new ones come up, but the city keeps being there. And some of our cities, as we know, they are 2,000 years old or something. So that would be a destructuring of the urban condition, you know, that respects the many differences, the different origin stories, etc. But at the same time, still, you know, connect in an urban format, you know, like a tissue that can be grown. That is sort of a bit the image that I have with our big cities. I don't know about small towns. That's another story.
Okay, thank you. Before I turn it over to Alain, I think I can we have about 25 minutes to deal with a number of very many questions that have been posed. And I think I just wanted to tie in my previous question, Alain, with a number of questions that have been posed. One is that one question is a city like New York City, if there is going to be increase in immigration to some of these large cities, are they ready for a massive increase in density in terms of infrastructure? What is the limits of density of cities? And I take this question of infrastructure and density to be one of the things that Saskia has been referring to as a kind of essence or core of cities. So I wonder, Alain, whether you think that there's a limit, whether you think cities can continue to become densified in the center in the light of these changes.
Look, the problem of densities is not really infrastructure. You know, don't forget again that the density of Paris and the density of Manhattan nearly 100 years ago now, was much higher than it is now, with, by the way, a fraction of the infrastructure. So the infrastructure is relatively cheap to deliver. And you can, if you look at, say, cities, I think the highest density I have noticed were in Hong Kong, in some neighborhood of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And the infrastructure just is designed to serve the density. Well, how do you pay for this infrastructure? If you have high density, it means high prices. Some people do not link the two, but in fact, there is no reason to have high density unless you have high land prices. You are using capital to substitute for land, and this is why you have high densities. I would refer to the book of Jason Barr. I don't know if Building the Skyline. This is the best book to understand how densities, technology, and finance all come together to produce skyscraper. So you have centrality in a large city like New York or Paris. You have also very specialized things, like, say, a Broadway show. A Broadway show requires not only the actor that we see, but a lot of manpower, extremely specialized, who are doing makeup, who are doing wigs, who are doing costumes. Those will not survive with only one show. They survive if the Broadway show are agglomerated in the same place, because so you see this specialization that we have in cities, extreme specialization, require agglomeration. To get back to your question about migration, if there were more people, I think that most of those people will live in the suburbs. Do not forget that, by the way, in the metropolitan area of New York, 70% of the commuting trips are from suburbs to suburbs. They are not from suburbs to Manhattan. Only 30% are from suburbs to Manhattan or within Manhattan. Same thing with Paris. Paris, which is smaller, 12 million, 70% of the trips are from suburbs to suburbs. So you see, you still need a center. However, Paris is known also for the opera, for museum, for art galleries. Those art galleries will not survive if they were distributed evenly in the entire metropolitan of Paris. They survive because they are together in the 6th arrondissement or in the 8th arrondissement. They group together. The same with Broadway. You have, of course, off-Broadway, and then you have off-Broadway, but it's still an agglomeration. You need this agglomeration.
Okay, thank you. There is a question also related to immigration and neighborhoods, which one of our attendees has asked, and that is about culture. And the question is, if there is a large migration of immigrants into historic cities, how do you, what will happen to the potential cultural conflict of immigrants who don't have the knowledge for the cultural history of the cities or working in those cities? Is there a potential that immigrants to particular cities lack the specific knowledge of that city, and that this could lead to a cultural conflict? What is your thought on those?
Shall I say?
Yes, Saskia, please.
I think that moment, it's a moment. It shouldn't be seen as a sort of a continuous factor. But the notion that you enter a culture that you don't know very well, that you are a foreigner, that is how cities emerge. So it is very much part of the history of cities to have, and then eventually it's the second generation and they're at home, but forever there will be other generations. Now, one little point that I do want to put on the table also is that there are cities today that are losing people. It's not that all cities are gaining,
Yeah.
But the main history of cities has been precisely the fact that they could handle, because let's just see it from the perspective of the city, not just the people, but the buildings, the transport, those cities, you look at them and you say, yeah, they are set up to handle people, as opposed to the people who are living in the city. They may say, what are these people doing here now? But when you pretend you are the city, so to speak, so imagine, that is what they're set up for. They're set up to be able, in well or not so well, to handle endless streams of new types of people. And you look at how many cities have existed for extraordinarily long times. I mean, in the United States, not so much, because the United States has a short history, compared with what you see in the Middle East, what you see in the Chinese regions, etc. So there is something that we have learned from long histories, histories of millennia, that the city fulfills a critical function. And it does so all over the world. And it does so in many different ways. And it's clearly not the only thing. But a city is really, it's our, our base. It's well, anyhow, I just said it, right? I do think that we tend to forget that, Now, separate subject, private entrepreneurs who set up private cities, and India, for instance, is full of them. That is a different story. That's more problematic. You see it a lot also in South America, because that is protecting, the rich protecting themselves from the poor. That is, to me, not the real essence of the urban condition. That's an innovation, and that is something that is growing. So a lot of what may look like a city can barely call it a city. A city is an open system. It's complex. It can handle all kinds of enmities. Enmities where different groups, they don't like each other, but the city is not the place where you're going to, continuously take out the guns and shoot the other. Though we have a bit of that in the United States, I should add, right? But that is it's a bit different. Those are gangs, etc.
Alain, would you like to address
Yes.
the question of culture?
Yes, culture. For me, I make a difference between culture and norms. If you, for instance, if I go to Singapore, as I am used to Manhattan, I tend to jaywalk. And very quickly in Singapore, if I'm lucky, not by a policeman, but somebody will tell me, hey, you shouldn't do that. And after 2 or 3 times, then I realize and I stop jaywalking. Now, if Singapore was importing a lot of New Yorker, I think that they could be submerged by, everybody would start jaywalking and the Singaporean would be really upset. And so I think that if you accept this scenario of manage migration to cities which are well organized but are losing population, I think that the people who migrate should be trained not to change their culture, but certain norms which are relatively simple. Jaywalking is one. Some are a little more complex. The way you dress, the way your attitude toward women, maybe to be on time for certain things, to certain things like that. Those are norms. They are not culture. Culture is what you eat, the way you consider if you are reverent to your grandfather or or things like that. These are cultural things which do not need to interfere. And we see that because, for instance, in every large city of the world, you find restaurants of very different culture. In New York, you find Ethiopian restaurant, you find Iranian restaurant, French restaurant. So people are not adverse to go to an Ethiopian restaurant. They may be adverse if somebody from another country does something that shocks things, but usually it's norms. It is not culture. So I think that this training on norms is very important, and we should differentiate. It is true that, for instance, say in France, where there is a strong, I think, movement against migration, people in a way identify lack of norms with culture, and they will take, any incident for, on norms, think, you see, those culture is incompatible with our thing. I think we have to make the difference and make a list of what the norms, if you want to settle in Denmark, what are the things that will not upset the Danes, but it's certainly not your native cooking or even the way you dress or whatever, which is part of your culture, or whether you read certain things or not.
Thank you, Alain. We have a question from Latin America, and the question is, what should a post-COVID urban policy in Latin American countries prioritize? This is a question from someone from the Economic Commission for Latin America. What should be the priority for, so let me just read out the question again. What should a post-COVID urban policy be for Latin American countries? What should be the priority areas?
Well, if I may, I think Latin America is, I grew up there. It's a mixed bag. Huh? It has some of the best services, best housing, best for the rich and for the very, very prosperous middle classes. And it is pretty dismal for the rest of the people, where those people are a bit on their own. So I think Latin America is one way in which to understand how capable we humans are to absolutely denigrate half of the population, in our city, something like that. Latin America is a very extreme case. If you go to North America, Canada, etc., and most of the European countries, you don't see the brutality that you see in Latin America. Now, Latin America also has enormously marvelous people who help and try to, I'm not saying that everybody's evil, but the way the system has been set up there, the elites really are very indifferent to, mostly very indifferent to what is happening there. I am actually, every time I go back, I am shocked. Now, there are a lot of very good people there too. Some of my best friends are from Latin America, and I grew up in Latin America. But it is to me quite interesting when I see the European cities and some of the Asian cities, how better they have done it, I think, than say the United States mostly, and certainly Latin America. That is sort of, it's a very general comment that I make, and there are many exceptions to what I said. But overall, there is a problem there, I would say. There is a problem.
Alain, could you address this question of what you see as the priorities for an urban policy? Should countries continue to emphasize greater urbanization? Is it density they should focus on? Is it productivity they should focus on? And what does that mean in practice?
I think that they should concentrate first on trying to listen and to what is happening in their own cities. There are, for instance, slums which have relatively high densities, which have very little infrastructure. Just don't think that the slum is going to disappear. Therefore, that's an excuse for not giving infrastructure. Just adapt to what is happening on the ground. If the pandemic results in change in land use, the best thing you can do is not to anticipate it, but to follow what is happening and to support, to remove the rigidities that you already have, in particular in your regulation. For instance, recently, I was reviewing the master plan of Guatemala City. And I think that this master plan, it's designed by very competent people. It's well done in the sense of the drawing. It's very clear, but it established an enormous rigidity, which do not reflect, I think, the way the city is growing. And do not forget again that a city is made by people. They are not made by planners. They are not made by mayors, genius mayors. No, they are made by people. So the best thing a city can do is monitor where the densities are, where people have difficulty getting to job, and try to solve those problems. Now, it's not a grandiose idea. It's not like, designing a linear city like in Saudi Arabia, 170 kilometers. It's not like that. It's just doing your job as I compare sometimes the mayors to a janitor. A good janitor does that. It takes care of who is there. So that's my advice. Remove rigidity. So to allow things to adjust, and respect if people are in high density in some area with low infrastructure, just develop the infrastructure to serve this density. Don't expect that you have a program in 20 years, those people will be in flats or whatever.
Thank you, Alain. I would just add that this is very clearly spelled out in Alain's book, Order Without Design. And I think one way of characterizing that is that policy should be market enabling in the sense of being sensitive to the decentralized decisions of firms and households. And the planners have a role in that, but it is to enable the maximum, let us say, ability of mobility around this area, and not focus on a particular, let's say, a priori design of the city. And I think that's a fair characterization of your approach. Do you agree, Alain?
Yes, certainly. Yes.
Okay. We have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to pose a question that has been raised about the social impact. I think this question was directed to Saskia. That if there is a move towards let us say, a more disaggregated city of neighborhoods, as you have put it out, what are the implications for segregation? I suppose the questioner is about on various social dimensions and inequalities in the city. What would be the impact on inequality and other forms of let's say segregation, either by ethnic group or social group or by class group?
I mean, that clearly is a very strong presence in many major cities that have very different groups, etc., different levels of income. Of course, that is in all cities. At the same time, I think that if people feel, whether you're poor or rich, but if you feel that the city is actually working for you. And that is why I like the Paris notion, right? That you have a lot of small concentrations of smallish shops so that everybody more or less can have, in principle, easy access to that. That is something that the citizen would appreciate, whether the citizen is an immigrant or a local, it doesn't matter. But what is it that makes the lives of people who live in cities more pleasant, more practical, more effective, etc., etc. So if one could bring in those three dimensions into how you design a city, and that is not usually done, those issues of whether the shopping and the issues of daily life are rarely part of the big projects about buildings, etc. And so I think it would take very little. And I think with the new generations who are also not obsessed with having cars and all of that, I think it's sort of like a natural region to wind up in. And that is that you walk to the shops which you need, for daily life, that you have more connections with your neighbors because you have neighborhoods. I mean, neighborhoods are not a bad thing. The risk with neighborhoods, and certainly that is the case in the United States, is of course racism. But many countries in the world don't have these extremely brutal histories of how one race was treated by another that the Americas have. Also in Latin America, we have that. That's a very important issue, you know, to recognize that. But I also think that if the cities more and more have these multiple centers rather than one big center, more and more people from different types of groupings, different levels of income, can have an easier way of connecting, whether they want it or not, you know, because it's like this is how it works. And so I keep thinking, and the second point I would like to do is that I think we have arrived at a point in some countries where we need new cities, for the simple reason that we are keeping expanding these cities, and the ones who pay the high price for those endless expansion of big cities are, of course, low-income people, and probably the marginalized, and et cetera, et cetera. I really think cities should make the effort of having reasonable sizes, and then confronting the difficulty, which right now seems like almost like an unnatural thing, building a city, whereas, you know, 200 years ago, that's what we were doing. We were building cities in this country. But now it's like building a city. It seems like something that is just not realistic. Well, I think the time has come, yes, that we don't keep expanding our very big cities, that we begin to build new cities. It's a bit of a radical observation.
I cannot help but turn to Alain to have a response to this, because I know he has a slightly different perspective on this.
Good.
And I guess I'd like to just throw into the mix while you're responding to this idea is to explain how you see the difference between polycentric cities and a 15-minute neighborhood. Or the 15-minute city. How are they different? But of course, I would also invite you to respond to Saskia's proposal that we should be designing new cities.
So let's talk about the last thing, the new cities. You know, cities do not locate anywhere. And, you know, at a certain time, I had a discussion with Paul Romer about, you know, he was advocating, and rightly so, you know, new cities, in a way, charter cities, where there would be new rules. And I told Paul, you know, the problem with that, because he was thinking about 15 new cities around the world.
Yeah.
I say, you know, the best location for cities are already taken. And, you know, you don't locate a city anywhere. Second, do not think that because you design a sewer system or a housing system or parks, that people are going to come to your city. You know, that's not the way it happened. If you look at the only really successful cities which has been created in the last 80 years, they are all capitals. That means that they were created by government, and people who have to move there were government employees. So of course they were followed by people who were opening restaurants and, you know, doing laundry or something like that. But basically, and those cities, by the way, are not particularly attractive. You know, Canberra is, you know, I'd rather live in, you know, in Sydney than Canberra, frankly. I mean, Canberra, Brasilia is one of the worst city, I think, in the world. So those created cities, I am not saying that we should never create cities, but we should create cities for a reason, not to decrease the size of other cities. You know, this debate about the optimum size of city, by the way, Brasilia was created that way. You know, they thought that Costa and Niemeyer thought that, you know, Brasilia should not be more than 500,000 people. And for a capital of a country as powerful as Brazil, this was a little naive. so the city is growing, but it's going into slums, which are on the western part of the cities. And the jewel, which has been designed by Costa and Niemeyer, is only for the high income people. So I'm not saying that we should not build new cities. Actually, I'm cooperating with sometimes some people who want to create new cities, but you need, you need to invest in infrastructure long in advance. And only if you have a large taxpayer base who is not aware where the money is going, you can do that. A private enterprise will have a very big problem finding, having negative cash flow on 20 years because they have to create sewer plant and water long in advance without knowing who is going to come. Unless, again, it's a company town, say Ford decide to create a new city in the middle of the Sahara, and they tell their employer, you have no choice, you go there. I mean, if they can do that, then it could work, but not a normal city the way Saskia described it, which is, mixed. A lot of people come here and things like that. So again, I'm not saying that a new city could not succeed, but as a policy from the government, I think it could result in a lot of waste in infrastructure. If you create a new city, let's say in Mexico City, let me finish, please. In Mexico is very centralized. Mexico State is enormous. You will have the government who spend money on infrastructure in an area where there is nobody, where in fact a lot of people in Mexico City do not have enough infrastructure. So, sorry, Saskia.
No, what I'm saying is that I think there is a kind of laziness in play that I'm addressing, and it has to do with the fact that those who do well, including the modest middle classes, I'm not just talking about the high level middle classes, no, lots of people, they do very fine. But where do the poorest of the people, that is what I'm addressing. Not simply making, more cities to make cities. No, recognizing the fact that in a given city, there are going to be super exploited workers inevitably. And at the edges, they will have the longest trips. They will arrive at their jobs deadly tired. They will barely see their children, etc. We have a lot of data on this. It is unfair. That is what I'm saying. I am not saying simply building a city. I'm saying if the cities are more reasonably sized, like they are mostly in Europe, frankly. Paris is an exception, there are a few exceptions, but if they're more reasonably sized, then you wouldn't have what you see in Brazil, what you see in Latin America, which is really an abuse of the poor, because the poor have to travel for 2 hours, they arrive dead tired, they barely see their families. That is what I'm addressing. In the United States, we barely have that condition that I'm talking about. It's especially in certain parts of the world. And so in that sense, I say, when it gets to that point, and we're getting in the Americas, we're getting at some cities that are arriving at that point, where some of the workers, a good part, maybe a third of the workers, have to travel every day, very long trips, bad traffic, etc. That is to me not acceptable and not desirable.
Every country has large cities and small cities. And so the people who migrate, there are a lot of poor people who migrate to large cities. Why don't they migrate to smaller cities? People in Mumbai, there are a lot of migrants who come from all over India. Usually they come from small cities or even villages. Why do they come to Mumbai? Nobody forced them to do that. They decide, when we foreigners, we look at their slum in Mumbai, we say, oh my God, what a terrible thing. But they made the decision, they voted with their feet.
But no, sir, that is precisely the point I'm trying to make, that we see all those people, they want to come here. Yeah, well, why do they want to come here? Because they want to live in a miserable place where they have to travel for 2 hours, arrive dead tired, barely see their children, etc., get ill and die earlier? No, because that's the only thing there is. And all I'm saying is, if we...
There are many small cities in India, I'm sorry, or medium-sized cities.
There are many small cities in India, and there are many small cities in the United States. All I'm saying is that the very, very large cities that we also have which is the minority of cities, where you see that the ones who suffer are the lower income classes who have, you know, etc.
I agree with you on that, but then develop infrastructure to solve these problems. You know, this is feasible.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Could I jump in? We are at the end of our 1.5 hours. Unfortunately, we have to stop. But you know, personally, I'd like to go on for another half an hour and learn from these fascinating perspectives on both sides. We are out of time. I think that the conversation has raised extremely important views from both sides and from different perspectives. And I encourage all the attendees to follow the work of these two eminent urbanists and explore these questions in more detail. So we don't have time for more, unfortunately. So it only leaves me to thank Saskia Sassen and Alain Bertaud for an extremely vigorous and interesting conversation. I would like to remind all the attendees that our next panel in our webinar series is on March 1st at 10 a.m., where we'll be looking at the role of journalism and forced migration. The panel is called Bearing Witness, and the role of journalists and media in forced migration. Thank you very much, Saskia. Thank you very much, Alain. And I hope we'll have a future opportunity. We'll have a future opportunity to continue the conversation.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the attendees from around the world. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.